Just beyond the false headlines, right behind the Kremlin propaganda, Putin's war machine is rusting out. And today you will see that the decay is structural. The timeline is accelerating. And this is the exact same pattern of failure that ended the Soviet Union. The first place that we see this decay is in the economy. That's where you see that the cracks are ever widening. The foundation of Russia's war effort is cracking from the strain. Just consider this. Russia's nominal GDP is about 2.2 trillion US dollars. Italy's GDP is about 2.1 trillion dollars. However, there's a very big difference. Italy has about 59 million people. Russia has 143 million people. And it also has many more resources than Italy. However, it produces far less. That exposes the chronic mismanagement inside the Kremlin, their inability to get their country to function like a normal state. Exports and energy were once masking this inefficiency. However, today, exports account for about 28% of GDP, but the structure is still collapsing. Raw materials bring in roughly $163 billion. Intermediate goods, another $129 billion. And capital goods, barely $21 billion. Russia's trade surplus in July was about $13 billion. That is down from a pre-war high of about $30 billion. Over $300 billion is in the central bank assets that are frozen abroad. Russia can't even access this money. Those reserves could finance pensions. They could pay for infrastructure. They could do a lot over the next decade. However, they won't be. Europeans are looking ever more likely that they will mobilize those funds, that they will take what is now frozen and turn them liquid. And when they do that, when they seize those funds, that will unlock Ukraine's ability to win. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I also happen to be a national security advisor who studies Russia, specifically the Putin regime. And there's no two ways about it. The situation is not very good for Russia today. Russia's got some significant problems, and the problems are getting worse by the day. And it's not cherry picking, just neutrally reading the news day after day in Russian, reading Telegram, reading what Russians themselves say. We know the situation is bad. This is not left to subjective opinion or interpretation. This is a fact. Things are very bad. However, the Kremlin doesn't want to admit that. The Kremlin usually gets away with this because it lies, as always. What it does is typically when it deals with international organizations such as the IMF, it reports that its economy is doing great. We have to understand that the IMF is not an auditor. Their job is not to analyze the data and to come back with their own interpretation. Their job is simply to compile the information. So they take Russia at its word. And that's why today we know that Russia is in a total disaster, because we see all the other indicators. We know it is simply impossible their economy is doing as well as they like to brag. And when they do brag about things, they do it very foolishly. Bragging about their incredibly low unemployment rate of about 2.2% is not so great. That's an indication of how very high today inflation is within Russia. But there's something else to that. Right now in Russia, the government's doing its most to prevent employers from being able to fire workers. As we've discussed before, the absurdity today is how many employees, how many factory workers are being told to go take a walk. You don't have to show up to work today because you're only working 3 days this week. You're only working 4 days this week. And that's across major corporations as well as with the National Railroad. This is not what happens in a good economy. The reason it's happening in Russia is because those companies, the railroads, don't have the liquidity to pay their workers. They have no other option because the Russian government won't let them be fired. The Russian government wants to keep this illusion that everybody's employed. However, they are technically fully employed. They're not making enough money to survive. Hence why half the population is looking for a second job. But I digress. Let's go back to the main issue here. What we see going on is the fact that even the largest companies in Russia, AvtoVAZ, for instance, which does vehicles, has 40,000 workers. It's moving them to 4-day work weeks. The missing component of all this is the fact that sanctions are what is changing the game. The sanctions have cut into all the heavy industry. Things like manufacturing often used Western parts. But now it looks ever more likely that there will be new sanctions, new pressure on Russia. Now, if that were to come to pass, what can Russia do? Well, the truth is, not very much. Because overtime has totally vanished within Russia. Morale is collapsing for the workers. Official wages, well, guess what? They have not been paid to many workers for a long time. In fact, there's over $20 billion owed to Russians across the country. This signals a sort of Soviet-style stagnation in industry. And how did that work out for the Soviet Union? Well, when an empire cannot pay its workers, soldiers are the next ones in line. The budget gap continues to grow. Taxes rise. The reserve fund shrinks under stress, and Russia's population continues to also shrink. None of these things are good for a country that is broke. In fact, the UN projects that Russia could fall between 74 to 112 million citizens by 2100. A workforce short of 11 million is expected by 2030. Labor drains faster than Moscow can even conscript replacements. Today, Russia is losing its population. It's losing its economy. In the long term, Russia cannot survive like this. It's just math. This is data, not subjective. The economic rot within Russia is contaminating everything. It's contaminating the skies. Today we see that the risk compounds with every flight. Flying inside of Russia is now a dangerous gamble. Consider this. Commercial crash fatalities rose from 12 in 2023 to 53 in 2025. Now, that might seem marginal, but that is a more than 4-time increase. That is significant, and there's no reason to think it'll get better. Sanctions at this point being put on countries that continue to sell airplane parts to Russia look like they will be tightened. So consider this. Though Russia does have Boeings and it has Airbuses, no Western jet in Russia has a valid airworthiness certificate. Each flight technically violates international maintenance rules. That's why we see that the airlines are cannibalizing parked jets. There's no other way to keep their other jets flying. Cargo Boeings are also being stripped for their parts. Passenger fleets depend on boneyards and smugglers at this point to keep flying. Just imagine that. The major airlines of Russia today depend on smugglers, literally people traveling with their suitcases with some of the parts they need. Of course, the larger parts do not come by suitcase. But either way, the fact remains. The airlines are engaged in such a pedestrian crime as smuggling because there's no other way their airplanes could continue flying. At this point, U.S. regulators have downgraded Russia's safety oversight to a Category 2. Category 2 means that the systemic regulator failure. That means that insurance premiums will spike. Investors will flee. The aviation sector once symbolized progress, but today we see something different. Now we see that it signals collapse. But that collapse is not unique to the airline industry. Military realities are also converting into bigger problems for the fiscal situation. And the fiscal situation is creating more problems for the military. It's now estimated that more than 1.1 million Russians have been killed and wounded in this war. That scale is simply unsustainable. It's truly historic. And the fact at this point is that they struggle still to get more soldiers. They're burning through them too fast. By comparison, the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan over the course of a decade, it lost about 15,000 soldiers. Today, at its current rate, Russia loses that many soldiers in less than 2 weeks. That's simply incredible. The math is catastrophic. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reports about 300,000 Russian losses just in 2025 alone. In fact, there's been projections by a number of other organizations that agree. CSIS has said that it exceeds 1 million. What's going to be the most interesting is what comes ahead, though. As the Russian soldiers are decreasing their use of armed personnel carriers, decreasing their use of defense, and simply going at it, running towards Ukrainian positions with guns in hand, it's probably not going to get any better. Those numbers will continue to get worse. Today, Russia has lost over 211,000 units of military equipment since 2022. About 1/5 of refining capacity has been destroyed by Ukrainian drones. Fuel supplies are tightening, logistics are collapsing. Moscow restricted gasoline exports in order to stabilize domestic prices. every single restriction is starving the front line. It means that at home, there's also less gasoline. That means that the deficits will grow, the borrowing will deepen, and the reserve funds will be drained faster than they can be replenished. But today we see that there's two different systems, and they're operating in opposite directions. The gap is strategic. Ukraine advances through innovation. Russia is decaying through fear. Look at what Ukraine does with Delta. Ukraine's Delta is amazing. It's for the battlefield, and it uses AI to queue targets within 2.2 seconds. The Avengers data pipeline, it flags about 12,000 Russian targets per week. Data turns into strikes, and the results follow within minutes. Ukraine's command network is decentralized. It works quickly, and it's stable. It will survive. But Russia has a vertical command. That vertical command costs lives because it creates huge delays. As Ukraine continues to modernize, it moves into the next century. Russia is going back to the Stone Age. Russia is imploding. We see that the generals are dying mysteriously and being arrested. Officials are committing suicide all of the time. Citizens are being persecuted across the country. Oligarchs are being chased out and their assets stolen. Fear is replacing competence. Across the board, it is not a pretty picture. So what else should we expect? What will we see ahead? Well, let's consider this. We are seeing today if the collapse resembles more something blowing up, or is it more of a controlled demolition? We are not asking if Russia will collapse or if the war machine will fail. We are watching it happen live. Today, we see that the global energy shifts are boxing Moscow in. Leverage is shrinking across every single quarter. Europe is tightening its enforcement on shadow tankers and its outdated hulls. Older ships, they meet inspection crackdowns. Flags are then pulled from the ships. Cargo faces choke points. India's refiners today report shrinking discounts on Russian crude. Discounts once over $35 per barrel have narrowed to just a single digit. At this point, we expect that there be more volatility in the market. That means that there's going to be greater risk for payments to be made. That means that China's stockpile of crude to shape the prices strategically will be used. China undoubtedly will take advantage of this moment to put more pressure on Moscow. China here is the big brother in the relationship. Undoubtedly, China is operating in its best interest. It might say that it is a best friend of Russia, but push come to shove. If Beijing has to choose between helping Moscow and helping Beijing, it will not be Moscow that's getting the help. China today is able to force Russia to do what it wants. And it's going to be able to do that with energy prices. It's going to be able to do that with oil. Keep in mind that Russian-Chinese trade, it's not small. It's about $245 billion in 2024. But today the imbalance is growing. Every day it is China that is winning in this relationship, not Russia. So really, what is Russia today? It's a resource appendage with shrinking power. And history shows how systems end when math and metal and morale all align. Empires that rot from within, they will eventually fall. Look at the Tsar who fell after 1917, after a war that he could not sustain. The communists in 1991, under economic strain they could not hide from. Putin's regime is following that same trajectory. As I've said, it is not a question as if, but when. When will be the final blow? Because today we are watching it collapse. When we say it is collapsing, it's like saying it is dying. It is a process. When somebody is dying, it could be a day or it could be a month. But it does not change the fact. The end result will be exactly the same. The Putin regime is going that way. It is going the way of the dinosaurs. And because of that, the world will be a better place. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. And consider becoming a channel member today. And leave your comments below. I love to read them. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.
We fight so every child can wake up safely, go to school without fear, play in peace and sleep in warmth, not under the constant dangers of war.
We fight so the children, wives and mothers can share everyday moments and life's milestones with their fathers, husbands and sons in real life, not in cemeteries.
We fight for our land. Fields are not for landmines. Forests are not for trenches, and beaches are not for naval attacks.
We fight for everyone, for every child, woman, elder and animal, for everyone who cannot defend themselves against the Russian occupiers.
We fight for Ukrainians internationally recognized 99 borders and for all the people who are currently under Russian illegal